Welcome, and it is so great to be with Dr. Greg Hutchings, who I have a long history with. I remember when he was working with Dr. Mort Sherman in Alexandria many years ago, where I first met him. And I've followed your career, Greg, as you've moved from Alexandria to Shaker Heights, and now back to Alexandria, where you are doing quite a remarkable job of bringing the question of equity for all in 2025. And how wonderful that is. Now, in addition to that, I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that Greg is really one of these remarkable people because he not only walks the talk, he walks the walk. And so he was just walking and we caught him walking, and now he's kind of made himself look like more of the gentleman that fine gentleman that he is. However, we caught him walking because self-care is one of the most important things that he's paying attention to as superintendent. So thank you, Greg, for both coming to your home, allowing us to join you, and seeing you both walking, and now we're asking you to do your talking.
That's
right.
right.
Our topic today is civility. So would you mind just beginning by telling us, as you think about the question of civility, especially in light of your strategic plan that calls for equity, talk a little bit about some of the ways that you bring your presence to community meetings or to people who are in your staff that is an indicator of your preparation and your mindset for having civil and civic conversations.
Yeah, well, first off, let me just say thank you, Benna, because we do go a way back. We go way back, and I appreciate the fact that you have been following my career, and it's still going. I'm like, wow. I even sometimes when I think about where I've been and where I am today, I'm amazed at some of the things that I've been able to accomplish with some phenomenal people in my life, like you. So thank you for that. And I do want to just say self-care really is so important. So I'm glad that you got to see me out walking. It's something that I share with our staff all the time, that the only way that we're going to be able to get through this global pandemic is by ensuring that we're taking care of ourselves. We can't help others if we haven't taken care of ourselves. And, everybody deals with this kind of stress in very different ways. And if you're not walking or running or working out or, just having a moment to yourself, you're just not going to be any good for anyone else. So it is so important to have the self-care at all times. And it's something I try to live by each day. So I think I'm in the best shape of my life during this global pandemic. So when we get back, people will still recognize me. But your question in regards to civility, I think is a really good question, especially for Alexandria, as we're talking about, and you talked about equity for all, that's the title of our strategic plan, but really our focus is around racial equity being the heart of our work. And that word race in itself brings so much discomfort. And it is very important that we push people into discomfort in order to see results, in order to see a change. And in order to do that, it does require civility, because if you're not going into this, and this is my approach, if you're not going into this having some compassion, right? But you still have to be unapologetic about making sure that you are dismantling what we call systemic racism within our school division. But you are going to have some compassion, because you're asking people to go places that they may have never been before. You're asking people to face such a harsh history that we have within our city of Alexandria, as well as across this country. And you have to make sure that people are able to deal with that. So we have to be there to lift people up, and not to just tear them down, but we really have to be there to pick them up when they fall, and to provide the necessary supports so that they can make it through this very troubling time, as well as this very challenging time to dismantle systemic racism.
So what are some of the strategies that you use that really are helpful in making that happen?
I think the biggest thing for us is trying to use our history as a starting point. I think sometimes we try to jump to solutions so quickly without going through the story. And I learned this from my grandmother, believe it or not. My grandmother's story, she was a storyteller. She's passed away now, but stories bring you into reality, and it allows you to kind of get an idea of where we've been. And that's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we can't just highlight the good things about, and I'm going to use Alexandria, for example, about our history. I mean, the simple fact that right on Duke Street in the city of Alexandria,
Yeah.
one of the largest slave trades was right there, So if we believe that systemic racism is not alive and thriving in 2020, where the foundation of our city is racism, we're fooling ourselves, right? So I think starting with the history for us is key, and taking our community through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And not just talking about the history to make people feel guilty, but talking about the history so that people can have an understanding of why we're in the place we are right now, and in the state that we're in right now. And then that also helps us to not repeat, those same mistakes. What we're doing is we're having what we call community reads and read-ins. And we're working with a professor from Georgetown named Douglas Reed. And Dr. Reed, he has written a book called Building the Federal Schoolhouse. It is a book that talks about the history of Alexandria City Public Schools from the time Thomas Chambliss Williams, which is also known as T.C. Williams, who was a huge segregationist in Alexandria. He was superintendent for 30 years. He did not believe Black and brown children should be in the same presence as white children at that particular time. And then when he retires, we named a school after him in the city of Alexandria, right? And a lot of people didn't know what TC stood for. I think that's probably why they hyphenate, did initials of his first and middle name, because if you Google Thomas Chambliss Williams, you'll see he's a racist, right? But us starting with that history, and I'm just giving you some examples of how we're able to really educate and build capacity with our community. So then we can start talking about the tough issues of the systemic racism that is today. You got to know where we come from first. And I think that is going to be key.
So when you're thinking about the tough issues, when you're engaging in a particular heated conversation, as the superintendent, what are again, some of the tips or strategies in how you navigate those conversations to continue to create a sense of healing, but also a sense of future forward thinking to how you're growing into the strategic plan?
Yeah. So, I think honesty is key, and seeking to understand. And what I mean by that is, if you're not, sometimes people say, being brutally honest can hurt people. And I think you need to go into, and I'm going to speak from our approach. We go into this knowing that somebody is going to feel some type of hurt or anger or disappointment or embarrassment by the things that we're going to discuss. And I think it's always important to start off with that conversation and saying that it's healthy and it's normal to feel those things. But we have to learn how to push through that. And we push through that by, allowing people to really speak their truth. And that's something that I think has been lacking in a lot of, the equity work and the anti-racism work and diversity training and cultural competency training, all the different names that we call, this work. I think that we forget that, we are going to have to be able to speak our truth, and we are going to have to be able to let people know you are going to feel uncomfortable, and that's normal. The only way we're going to see a difference or a change in a particular behavior is by facing the reality and hearing people's truths. I think you then have to take it even further than hearing somebody's truth. So me telling you a story about my life, that's just my personal story. I'm not going to speak on behalf of all African Americans, across the country. But my story should matter, and my story should have some type of presence, and it should have some validation. Even if you don't completely understand, you should respect it. And I think the more that people can have that respect, that empathy, and push through their discomfort, I think that's how you get to the other side of acceptance and now being able to tackle, some of the challenges that, we have before us.
So really, I can't resist and say that, you know, when you think about the habits of mind, listening with understanding and empathy is what you're saying right now, which is how do we really, it seemed to me as I was listening to you, the first habit of mind that I know that you have really always believed in is what I would call the habit of managing impulsivity,
That's right.
which is don't just act before you think. And then the next is listening with understanding and empathy, because that's how you really hear those stories. And you feel that although they're personal, which is why we talk about personalized learning, it's because everything is highly personal.
That's right.
But it's also being capable of hearing those stories, listening to them. And then the third habit would be, and thinking flexibly, being willing to say, that's your point of view, that's your story. And it's not my story. But if I can listen to you and learn from you, and you can listen to me and learn from me, then there's the possibility that we will move future forward in a way that really is respectful and is understanding of both our commonalities as well as our differences.
That's very true. You know, my teachers in elementary school would say, well, Gregory was very impulsive. My wife would probably tell you that in our early phases of marriage, I was impulsive. But there's been a lot of lessons learned on my end.
Talk more about that. Like, what's one of your lessons learned on how you manage your impulsivity?
You know what I've learned? I learned at an early age. I mean, fortunately for me, I went into leadership very early. So I was immature, right? A lot of my impulsivity was immaturity. And I think time gave me the maturity and the understanding to realize that, you know, it's not how fast you get things done. Sometimes slow and steady, it wins the game. And you know, I realized that when I became, you know, a principal back in Nashville, when I was in Nashville. And, you know, I was coming in like, okay, we need to get this stuff done tomorrow.
Yeah.
Not realizing that you have to have your team on board with you in order to do that. I can't just be the only one saying we need to get this stuff done. So I had to learn at a very early age and early in my career, which I'm fortunate that I did learn that early in my career because I wouldn't be able to survive now if I didn't. It's about bringing a whole team along, and it's not about you as the leader always leading the way. Different people can move into that position of leadership depending on the particular topic or you know, matter that you're trying to conquer. And I'm glad that I follow that philosophy even till today. You know, I believe that it's in shared leadership. I believe in making sure that others have opportunities to lead. Even with this pandemic right now, you know, I'm not the face of the global pandemic for Alexandria City Public Schools. We have a task force. We have, you know, our Virtual Plus learning advisory team. You know, we have staff, we have chiefs, you know, so there are different people who are leading these efforts. And yes, I am required to make sure that I'm abreast of everything that's going on. And of course, I'm going to have the final say, but I believe in using the input from others to make my decisions. I don't make decisions in a vacuum or in isolation. And I think that's key.
Well, and what we just heard you describe is, again, engaging in thinking flexibly and thinking interdependently. In other words, you are not just abreast, but continue to be a leader of the system. So not only are you bringing a team along, you're bringing a community along with you.
That's
and
right.
I think the interesting dynamic, as I was listening to you a few moments ago, the challenge of when you speak your truth, the way it impacts others. So the one final question I have is around reflection. So as we continue to speak our truths that may or may not be lining up with one another, whether it's in a particular meeting or on a hot button issue, COVID related, race related, what have you. In what ways do you engage in a reflection piece toward the end of particular meetings or challenges? So how do you, in the teacher role, go for closure to make sure that as we engaged in something that typically may push us outside of our comfort zone, how do we make sure that the health has continued to be something that you're tending to before people are scattering to the winds?
Yeah. I think it's important, and what we do is we have to have continuous check-ins along the way. And check-ins are times to reflect on what we just discussed, times to talk about what you're feeling right now based on the discussion. Sometimes having a mind break, people need to just step away for a moment, and that's okay, but you got to come back. You know, you can't step away and not come back. And I think giving people some space is important. That's a practice that we use. We also we do community circles, and this comes out of the whole restorative practices methodology, where everyone's able to really speak about whatever they want. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you just need to talk. And starting our meetings with community circles is specifically when we're doing things that relate to any type of equity training is key. And building relationships, I think, is also key, because it is very difficult if you're walking into a space and it's people you don't even know. It's hard to speak your truth. So you got to have opportunities to really build relationships before you get into the deep kind of like core of your issues. You can't just walk in and say, okay, well, tell me about your life. You know, you got to first say, well, tell me about why I like education or why I'm an educator, you know, those types of things, those warm and fuzzy questions first. And then you get into more of the nitty gritty and asking some of those core value type of questions and getting to some of the core issues.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Greg. And, you know, it occurs to me, and I think that this is probably true for all of us. We don't really know a truth. We know our truth as it evolves over years and as our narrative changes based on what we learn. And just as the narrative that you talked about, that you felt that your sense of urgency was one you were going to run ahead with until you had another narrative, you had another truth. And the truth was that leadership is not just about your position, it's about the way you cultivate the leading of all others so that they behave like the kinds of people that can take leadership. So it's all, in a way, a truth is, as Stephen Colbert might say, it's truthiness. It's kind of, you speak your truth as you know it now and as you understand it and as it grows. And I can see that you are really representing that and living that, and you are growing. It is just such a pleasure to be able to be with you. And I want to just thank you for taking the time in your very busy schedule. And keep on walking. You look great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will keep on walking. I just want to also say that, you know, I think as you mentioned earlier, or just now, true and effective leadership is when all the people around you are leaders too. You know, that is how you really demonstrate that you are an effective leader. You know, if you are the only leader in the room, then you're just somebody that's full of smoke. You got a big old head, right? You need to be in a room full of leaders. Your team should demonstrate the same leadership. And I always use VIP as my mantra: vision, integrity, passion, right? If you have VIP, then you can do anything. All those other credentials and things you have to get your license, right? So you got to have the masters and the doctorate and the the endorsements and your licensure and that type of thing. When you have the vision and when you have the integrity and the passion for what you do, anything is possible at that point. And we're in a profession, which education I take very seriously, because it literally molds the entire world. And being in the education profession, it is so important that we come correct and that we show up every day willing to give 100%. And that's why when I start off with the self-care component, it's key, because if you don't have yourself together, you're not going to be able to change the world and to produce the next generation of leaders who is hopefully going to change this narrative that we currently have in our country.